Good morning, good morning. I'm Yannis Natsis. I'm the director of the European Social Insurance Platform, ECIP. ECIP is the umbrella association that brings together the social insurances in Brussels, 46 members from 18 EU member states plus Switzerland. And it's a pleasure to welcome you here, to welcome you back to the Valley, or for the newcomers, this is gonna be an amazing experience. There's no better way to start this conversation but by this session. This session is going to analyze what is the impact of the public contributions, the public support, the multi-layered public support that goes into biomedical R&D in Europe and beyond. And how does that affect pricing? How does that affect the decisions that we are taking in Europe in order to reimburse medicines, but also to set the prices for those medicines? And the key question we're going to ask is, are we transparent enough? Is the system transparent enough? And this discussion comes at a very important time for the very simple reason that we are in the process in Brussels under the Danish presidency of concluding the European pharma legislation negotiations that have been lengthy on this very, very important reform of the legislative framework in Europe on how we authorize medicines, how we go about strengthening our negotiation leverage in negotiating with the companies. And of course, one of those components in perhaps having more informed or evidence-based negotiations is the important element of knowing about the public support and the ways that governments, that the public in general, academia, supports biomedical R&D. And of course, this comes at a crucial time, aside from the ongoing negotiations, because we see that there are a lot of discussions about strengthening Europe, reindustrializing Europe, strengthening Europe's strategic autonomy, making Europe great again in a way by strengthening the continent's competitiveness, which means that there are demands, there are ongoing discussions about giving companies more support. Therefore, I think that explains in itself why today's discussion this morning to kick off the European Health Forum Gerstein 2025 is the ideal setting. And I would like to welcome on stage Claudia Wild. Claudia Wild is actually the architect of this session to walk us through a bit more precisely the exact relevance of this session and how the session links to the ongoing discussions in the Council as we speak in Brussels. Please, Claudia, over to you.
Yes, thank you, and good morning on this winter day in Bad Gastein. Maybe some of you are aware of this article 57 in the directive that says that from now on, or when the legislation is finally negotiated, pharma companies need to declare what kind of public contributions they have received for development of their drugs. And this is totally independent on from which entity these public contributions came. First of all, the knowledge I will present here is has been gathered by within a European project called HI-PRIX. And when I say we, I'm together with my colleague Daniel Fabian, who is actually doing the researches. We hear day in and day out that the high prices has to be justified by the high R&D costs in the private sector. But nevertheless, this is only part of the truth, and the other part of the truth I would like to question here, or I would like to present here, and to stimulate your imagination what the public contributions actually are. And when you look at the full range of the value chain, how drugs are being developed, you see it from basic research. Everybody, I assume, associates the basic research with academic inputs, but that doesn't stop there. We do know about the IHI initiatives. There are a lot of horizontal pre-competitive activities are happening there, like setting up of compound databases, setting up of AI screening tools to screen the compound databases to identify targets for new drugs. And then thereafter, as soon as a target is being identified, the primary investigators usually start to create small startups or spin-outs of the universities, and those small startups are being heavily supported by the technology transfer units of universities. They are heavily supported by innovation grants, and actually we have been in our researches very much impressed how much money is there for innovation support. And thereafter, those small companies start with preclinical and first clinical studies, and as soon as there are positive results of those early studies, the big companies come in and acquire those companies, and thereafter they run the phase 2 or phase 3 studies, if there are phase 3 studies, and go into regulation, go into approval, and thereafter, since many things are being approved on a very low evidence level, the evidence generation activity starts within the public sector on setting up registry, indication registries, and collecting data on the real-world evidence. So there is the full range of public contributions, besides, of course, getting the infrastructure, getting the education for the personnel that is needed. But I think we are all aware that drug development or innovation development is very much a complementary activity between the private and the public sector. Now, within the HI-PRIX project, we have done quite a bit of primary research on what other research groups have found and on the public contributions, namely how much is being done and in which stages of the development these public contributions happen. And we can see that from the data from the US, that almost over 90% of all target research is being done in academic settings, and thereafter even product research, up to half of all products coming to the market have been supported by public money, of which even more for priority review products, namely not the Me Too products, but those who are more beneficial than others. Nearly all vaccines have been developed in the public sector and then been taken over by industry, and even more than 10% of all health research money from the European Commission runs into late-stage trials. So these are quite impressive data. What I already explained is that there is development history starting from the academics and then running through technology transfer, spin-outs, small companies, acquisition of those small companies, and running into the approval, in the stage of the approval. This is the generic pathway. And if you now say, well, this is theory or this is plain paper, I will show you that this is not plain paper, because in Austria we have, thanks to the HTA regulation, we started a drug appraisal committee, and within this drug assessments there is a certain chapter devoted only to there's research on the public contributions to the drugs coming in. Now, those drugs are, for the time being, only the very expensive ones. And when I say very expensive ones, then I mean 1 million, 2 million euro. Or, here you see exactly what I've been explaining in the generic model. It always starts, and blue stands for public, green stands for private, and the mixture of those colors is a private-public partnerships. So you see here, it's always starting in academics, and then it moves slowly towards private ownership. And finally, it is being approved by private companies. So this is the pattern. It's always the same. It's not in a singular cases, but it's always the same pattern. And when we even move more forward, we have been looking to two large European companies. One of these that has approved 25 compounds, so 25 products within the period of 2014 to 2024, of which 64% have been either acquired, licensed, or co-developed, and only 1/4 has been developed in-house by those companies. So this pattern, you can look at this pattern from all sides, from all perspectives. It always comes back to the acquisition, to acquiring public developments. We have now, and I will not go through this recommendation list, but I can boil it down to what the main messages is. In order to implement this Article 57, we need to standardize the definitions on what is R&D, like is acquisition R&D, can this be counted as R&D, or is this a financial instrument? But we also have to force the public entities to report their contributions in a standardized manner. And this is exactly what the panel is all about. And I think I hand over to Yannis again to start the panel. But my main message is we have, and that's why this panel fits so well into this conference here. It's drug development is a complementary activity. There is a lot of risk and investment involved coming from the public and coming from the private. But the profit only goes to the private entity, and there's no public return on public investment at all. And this has to change in times of thinking about solidarity.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you for setting the scene for us in times when the European Union is considering its pharma legislation, in times when the European Union is considering having a Biotech Act, and all of these pieces of legislation include the support coming from the public in many shapes and forms. And of course, there will be a cost for these pieces of legislation. And there will be a lot of incentives and a lot of benefits and perks granted to the company. So it is important that we get the balance right, and at least we know when we map this multi-layered public support, and we get, as you said, also the definitions right. And all of this, ladies and gentlemen, is happening at times when money is tight. And let's be very honest about it. Public budgets are under tremendous pressure, especially because of a lot of big competing priorities. Please, join me in a round of applause for our speakers. Please, Audun Haga, Jacques Demotte, and Michelle Childs, come and join me on stage to kick off our conversation. And of course, Ilaria Valli as well. Ilaria is joining us online. We don't have the right slide, but we will get to the right slide. That's fine. And of course, you saw a QR code before, and I'm sure we will have it on screen again. You see it over there, so feel free to participate. And my colleague Benedetta Baldini and Jan Gasteiner at the newsroom will be able to also tell us what's happening online, which are your questions, and how you would like to contribute to this discussion. Ilaria, buongiorno, are you with us? Can you hear us? Yes, we see you.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thanks
Wonderful.
for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. So I'll start with Audun. It's great to see you again. So ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who don't know Audun Haga, he is the former director of the Norwegian Medicines Agency. But he is a very important person for this conversation because he was there at the birth of the Oslo Medicines Initiative, what is called now the Novel Medicines Platform discussion at the WHO Europe level, but also involved in the negotiations for the WHA resolution on transparency. I think that was back in 2019. It feels like a long time ago, which of course also talked about transparency overall in the pharmaceutical systems. What do you make of this discussion now that fast forward from 2019 to now, from the WHA in Geneva to having this article, Article 57, that Claudia just presented? We've come a long way. In the meantime, there are intense discussions in Europe also about the affordability of medicines, about the competitiveness of the sector. What is your take on this?
When it comes to this information that we get here, I think it's very important. It's super interesting information, and I'm not aware that any of the authorities are able to, in a systematic and structured way, to use this information at the moment. At least not in Norway, we're not ready for this. And I'm not aware of any other markets either. But again, it's super valuable. So we need to get that into the price-setting mechanism one way or another. And I've spent a large chunk of my career on HTA and price setting and things like that, ending up with value-based pricing. It started out nicely as being sort of an instrument that should secure that society didn't pay way too much for innovation. But now it has developed into the absolute lower limit, price limit, that the industry is in full right of demanding, which is very different from the intention. If you think about it, that takes away the total consumer surplus in this system. It means that the price we're paying is not adding any extra benefit, health benefit to society in total. Everything is extracted. And I'm not aware of any other market that uses such a concept. And imagine, Yannis, if a very innovative life vest producer said, okay, I'm going to use value-based pricing. That wouldn't work. He wouldn't sell much. So now it's very incorporated into our market of pharmaceuticals. And I think the whole system is thrown off balance. The system that should sort of keep the balance between bringing new innovation but at a sustainable level for society, so that we could share this. So I think we definitely need a new pricing policy. And during the discussions in Oslo Medicines Initiative, we had discussions with the industry. And they sort of accepted that, okay, we need to share the benefit of innovation. And then we started discussing a cost-based or a cost-based plus model. That encouraged a lot of head shaking. And I tend to agree that creates strange incentives. But then we discussed, what about the value-based minus? That we start out with a value-based price and then deduct for certain components. And in such a model, I think this public contribution would be a very important factor to get in there. And I suggest that we start out to develop some sort of value-based minus fair price calculator. That would be very nice indeed, I think. Find out what to deduct from the value-based to get to a fair price that regains the balance in the system. And that would also be very transparent. Imagine getting away from this special price for you, my friend, if you don't tell anybody, system that we have in Europe at the moment. So to develop such a thing is not something that one single market can do. That would be totally impossible. I think this has to be developed on a at least European basis, and we also have to bring in industry in these discussions. So I think we need a calculator for value-based minus pricing and use this information in that. Thanks.
Some very clear asks from Audun to help us get started with the discussion, and clear to the point, actually. Michelle Childs, thank you very much for coming. It's great to see you here at the European Health Forum Gastein 2025. Michelle Childs is a member of the leadership team of the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, DNDI. DNDI is a very important player in this field, a long-standing important player in this field, with decades, if I'm not mistaken, about 30 years, if I'm not, or even 20 years of experience of actually developing and putting products on the market by teaming up also with companies, but where the commercial interest is not there. And that's why you have developed, DNDI has developed products in recent years on neglected diseases. So tell us a bit from your perspective, because you have this practical, operational experience thanks to the DNDI. Is this conversation relevant? Is this possible, based on the experience of DNDI, to use this information to map this public support that goes into biomedical R&D, and especially coming from you, that you are active in a field where commercial interest is not high. It's not, it's not profit-driven, let's say, your drug development.
Sure. So DNDI, as you say, is a not-for-profit R&D organisation, and we bring together the best science from academic, public and private partnerships. But we are funded by public and philanthropic funding, including from the European Commission and member states. Thank you for that. And so, I mean, I think for us, the importance of this debate and the importance of transparency of R&D costs is that it allows first of all, us, and we are one of the few organisations that publishes our actual R&D costs, and I'll go into that in a minute. It's an accountability mechanism. You know, we believe that a public return on public investment also requires those who receive that money to be accountable and transparent about that, how much and how far that money has been used. We also think it allows policymakers to ask better questions, not just in relation to pricing, but also in relation to setting the incentives and approaches for investments into the new medicines that we need, you know, whether that is by direct, by grants or indirect mechanisms. And that's why we both support this ourselves by publishing our R&D data, but also support these types of provisions. I just want to illustrate why, you know, why it's important to have transparency by looking at some of the things that we do. So one of the things that we're doing at the moment is that we are just finalizing an up-to-date study on our R&D costs. And the purpose of that study is to look at our historic costs of 21 therapeutic innovations, but also to use that historic data to look at, you know, what the actual costs going forward would be. And I think that, you know, everyone's interested in the headline costs, and it's so new I have to kind of look at those. We're going to put it for publication, so it's pre-publication at the moment. But I think that, you know, our historic costs show that, you know, you're looking at a range between 1 and 91 million for the range of therapeutics that we develop. So this ranges from new chemical entities to also repurposed drugs for different populations and
what's the figure again, Michelle?
This is it's between 1 and 91 million. This does not include in-kind contributions from the industry, which is roughly about 12%, although many of them are reluctant to really specify what that is, but that's what we generally think it is. If we look at novel drugs going forward, and I think the important thing is when you're looking at trying to look at R&D costs, you look at the actual costs, but also the failure rate. You know, R&D is a risky business, so you also have to factor into the failure rate, which is called attrition. And if we factor that in, our actual attrition has been lower than the industry rates for a variety of reasons. But if we factor in the industry attrition rates plus our historical costings, we're looking for novel drugs, if you're going forward, which is new chemical entities, a medium of 142 million. I mean, the top of the range is probably about 276 million euros. If we're looking at repurposed drugs, then you're looking at the medium of 7 million and between 1 and 37 million. And everyone, when we say that, everyone goes, well, that's massively different from some of the industry costings, and particularly the famous one, which is Damasi and Tufts. And I think the other thing that we're trying to do with this study...
Which puts the figure up to...
It's the $2.5 billion pill. So what we've also tried to do with this study, and I think this is important, is to try and identify what are the cost drivers, what are the differences, and some of the similarities. And I think if you look at the cost drivers, they really fall into a sort of a number of areas. Firstly, it's the type of area that you're working in. I think if you're talking about infectious diseases, we know that some of the attrition rates are lower. We also know that because some of the medicines are so bad or non-existent, you need smaller numbers of people in the trials, so the trial costs are lower. The other thing that's important about public money is that you don't have the costs of borrowing. And if you look at the Damasi study, over half of those costs are the opportunity costs of borrowing. I think the other thing is to do with our not-for-profit model, which is that we have lower attrition rates generally because our attrition is not based on commercial decision-making. It's just based on whether the science works or not, you know, whether you can actually take this forward rather than whether you're going to make a profit at the end. It's also that we don't have to borrow because we have public money. And we also benefit from certain regulatory advancements and benefit from the in-kind contributions from others. So the reason that I wanted to explain this is that, you know, some of the things that we need, which Claudia has talked about, is that we do need, first of all, a requirement, because we are one of the only organizations that do this. And so that you do need a requirement to mandate this. Secondly, you do need to have some clear methodologies and data points, and we have set that out. We've set out what our methodology is. You also need to have nuance in interpretation. You need to understand what are the cost drivers and the differences between the different things that you're looking at. You know, the Gates Foundation has also come out with a sort of overarching view of a sort of 120 clinical trials, and they, for example, have shown that vaccine trials are generally more expensive than therapeutic trials. And I think that's important to also get the trust of people who are handing over that data, that you're not just going to go, okay, what is the cheapest trial and why is yours not at the same level? But you understand what some of the legitimate cost drivers might be. And then I think that the final thing is that if you are using public funding or giving public funding, it is important that you act as an investor. So you put terms and conditions on that funding, which includes transparency, but you can also include terms and conditions which require affordability built in, particularly at the early stage of R&D.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and that's very, very important, especially because, as I explained before, in the European Union, we are debating all of these pieces of legislation, and I'm hearing so many very expensive carrots being considered to be offered to the companies without so many sticks. And it feels like the legislators feel or believe that they can put incentives on paper and somehow money is going to be created to be made available to pay for all of these expensive carrots. So I heard transparency, accountability, sharing very concrete and operational insights from the experience, the hands-on experience that you have from the DNDi. Speaking of non-profit, please, Jacques, allow me to go to Ilaria, who is online. Ilaria, thank you very much for joining us from Fondazione Teleton. What is your experience? Because Fondazione Teleton and also other Teleton in other countries, you invest also in clinical research, you invest in clinical trials. What is your experience and how do you do this business with also the companies?
So thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. I joined Fondazione Teleton pretty recently, coming from a long-lasting experience on the side of the industry. And what I can share is that I'm learning a lot here. Fondazione Teleton is a non-profit organization that has more than 30 years of history. Started as a funding agency for fundamental science, and then moved along the years to the great idea of building in a way and driving two major research institutes in gene therapy. We are still funding extramural research, but over the years, what is pretty unique of this organization is that at a certain point, starting from 2015, there was a big evolution and a strong determination to ensure that science could turn into a cure. And we went through a journey of obviously equipping ourselves and building capabilities to run development. And we went through different experiences, starting from industrial collaboration and partnership that were the ones that allow us to have the first gene therapy approved in the world through the collaboration with GSK. After that, obviously, similarly to what, let's say, Michelle told us, let's say we are focused on rare genetic diseases. So we are a private organization that is fundamentally, let's say, using philanthropic money. And we are, in a way, in a journey of improving, in a way, somehow, our ability to ensure that we can enter in every single, in a way, situation where the market fails. So from the journey of development in collaboration with the industry, as everybody knows, let's say the industry started to be less and less interested in conditions, because obviously the business case is not there from their perspective. So the initial collaboration with the industry and the development progressively show in a way to not be a, how can I say, more affordable or viable path for us. And this is why, let's say, in the last few years, we turned to, in a way, grow as a development biotech organization that is able to run drug development. In this journey, as you can imagine, we are learning a lot around how expensive and difficult is drug development for an organization like us. But we are doing this with pride, and we are, let's say, in a nice journey. We are now in the middle of an important submission of a new drug to FDA and EMA. So, and we are acting also as a marketing authorization holder, so covering the full value chain from early science to development to market operation and commercialization. So this is, let's say, what is helping us to have a look in, how can I say, the full value chain and having an understanding of what is working and what is not working. First of all, we do not have, in a way, really, we do not manage big public funding. We have, in a way, in our revenues, some grants, but the majority of the resources is philanthropic money. Nevertheless, obviously, we have experienced this non-profit approach that relates also to the industry. The first way for us to measure return on investment is obviously the focus on the impact on patients. So we license out in the past our products with the clear condition that in case of market failure, the license would be back to us. And this is exactly what happened with the first gene therapy approved. And we also set, in a way, a number of rules, obviously, to ensure our sustainability through royalties. And may I say that so far this was enough. Now that we have a relevant pipeline of more than 13 assets that are ready, let's say, to enter into translation, this is not in a way enough anymore, and we are looking for different type of collaboration. The return of investment from our perspective should be seen in royalties, obviously, should be seen in a way also the ability to reinforce, in a way, the sector in the country, the competencies and the capabilities. Under the clear lights that at this point, in a way, there is no, honestly, clear example of a public institution that is really able to really cover the full value chain. We are doing this as a non-profit, leveraging on philanthropic money with a lot in the way of effort. So when thinking about transparency and the relationship with the industry, I'm not the best person, obviously, to comment on that. I do not have, in a way, a super clear and specific expertise. but I recommend us to stay balanced, because so far the idea of full development activity in the hands of the public sector or non-profit sector is really far from reality. And we have in a way to really probably imagine partnership with the industry in a way that will make the industry interested in doing what we do. In the case of rare, this is not happening. And this means in a way that we are in front of the challenge of having a lot of science ready to impact on patients, but not enough resources to do that.
Thank you, Laria. Also very clear, and that gives me a very nice bridge to go to Jacques Demotte, Director of the European Research Infrastructure and Clinical Research here in Europe. Jacques, talking about this public-private partnerships, Ilaria said, how do we get the terms and conditions right of these partnerships, because nobody can do it, can get it done alone. I was also intrigued, and I'll come back to you, Ilaria, on this, because you said that in terms of your contractual agreements, you want to go even further, because you see yourselves that you're going even further, so that to go beyond asking for royalties, so we'll come back to that. But Jacques, from your experience, years and years of experience, you're a very well-known name here in Europe. What would you say, especially as, once again, also at the political level, there are so many discussions about making Europe attractive again, attracting more and more clinical trials. We see clinical trials happening more and more in China. Please, your insights.
Thank you. So it's a lot of questions. I will start with a very simple answer. If we consider the public contribution to drug development, there are three different aspects. First of all, the public sector is in charge of developing the science base, understanding the biological mechanism, the mechanism of disease, and this has to be published. And published means that you make the data public. So the data are not stored in a university, in a hospital for the purpose of licensing. It is really the objective of researchers to publish. The second contribution is the support to public and also to private innovation. And this is achieved through two different mechanisms. Financial mechanism like the Innovative Health Initiative or the European Innovation Council and so on. So this is financial support. On the other hand, there is also infrastructure support, meaning the infrastructure are a series of organizations whose mission is to provide services either to academic or to public project. And this is a very important tool. I will come back. And the third situation is really academic innovation. And this, in the past, this was not so common. Now there are some examples of academic innovation, and especially the new development of biologics is a playground for academic innovation, meaning that, for instance, the CAR-T cell can be developed independently of the industry. If I come back to the infrastructure, there is a whole pipeline of infrastructures that were created in Europe between 10 and 20 years ago. And all this infrastructure covers the pipeline of innovation, meaning that there is, for instance, the Instruct for the structural biology, which is key to identify the target of the drug. There is also the EU Open Screen with screening facility and chemical library. There are InfraFrontier, for instance, which is the infrastructure for animal models and phenotyping. There is BBMRI, because we are in Austria, BBMRI for the biobanks, EATRIS for translational research. EQUIN is just one of the pearl on this series of infrastructure. I must say that this infrastructure currently are used by academics, are used by SMEs, and not that much by the big pharma. But probably this could be better promoted. Just to remind you, in the US, 60, 70 years ago, there was a discussion, and the Senator Edward Kennedy, the brother of John Kennedy and also the nephew of the current Robert Kennedy, promoted the idea of having the clinical trials for drug registration run by a public organization, meaning the NIH. And this this debate lasted for more than 10 years, and there are still people coming with this idea. And I think that this could be something to be considered to contain the cost of clinical development, because I'm aware that clinical development represents 2/3 of the investment of pharma companies in research and development. So this would be a way to contain the cost, and also to contain the need for monitoring and for quality control of the trials. So you know that recently there was a STOA report. The STOA stands for I don't know, Science and Technology Office in the European Parliament. And the STOA asked for an Italian economist, Massimo Flori, to prepare a report on what could be a medical research infrastructure able to perform the full development of new drugs, especially in the field of neglected disease. So he came to the conclusion, so of course I was interviewed like the other research infrastructure directors, but the conclusion is that this would require a funding level in the range of 6 billion euros per year, which is a lot. And so this report was published, but not disseminated that much. I think this is a good and a bad idea, meaning that this would in fact duplicate what already exists, because if you consider the capacity of the individual infrastructure, if you put them together, this covers all the competencies. But the current organization of these infrastructures is not adapted to run the full development, just to provide services to different segments of the development pipeline. So this is an interesting question that has to be further explored. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques. I think we've heard a nice flow of conversation so far with 4 complementary perspectives. We have the privilege of being joined here in the room by Steven Thirstrup, the Chief Medical Officer of the European Medicines Agency. Steven, I'll come to you and ask. Let me just get you perhaps a mic. Here you are.
Thank you.
So where does the EMA come in all of this? And would the European Medicines Agency be able to contribute to, as we said, increasing the transparency in the system in that way, and the accountability, and collect data, or how could we also support the agency in doing so, if that would be a prospect? Please, over to you.
So thank you. Interesting panel, a good discussion. First of all, the negotiation of the pharma legislation ongoing, and we don't have a share in what is happening now, so we are bystanders to that. The Article 57 database already exists, as you alluded to, Horton, and it's available, or at least part of it is available in an enormous Excel file on our website, 7-point-something megabytes, recently updated. It's been there for the past 7 years, and it contains a lot of the information that is mandatory for industry to provide. And what I hear is that the current proposal is then mandating industry, or not industry, I think it is developers, to add more data to that database that we maintain. So fundamentally, we maintain it, and part of our obligations to transparency, we make it public available. And I think if it should make any sense to add these data, for me, we will also have to add them to the public-facing enormous Excel file, or whatever platform we could think about technological to move with it. But listening to this, I'm pretty sure industry will say, well, this is another obligation for us, and obligations don't come free, so it's also a burden, and burden is associated with costs. So I was thinking about those who are not big pharma, and happy to have Fondation Ted Lyon here on the call, because you are also a marketing authorization holder, although a small marketing authorization holder, and you will be hit by the same obligation to add data to this database within certain time frames, and we could potentially come after you if you don't comply. What are your feelings about that we add this obligation also to the SMEs and non-commercial marketing authorization holders?
Ilaria, over to you. Thank you, Steven.
Thank you for the question and thank you for the consideration of our specificity that is on this front, likewise many other in a way front. Obviously, in a way, we are looking at this with a certain degree of concern. Likewise, we are looking at the number of regulation with concern when it's also about one of the points that was mentioned before, in a way, the overall cost and requirement around clinical trials for an organization like one year, presenting a big effort around the rare conditions is really helpful. And we are in a dialogue with Italian authorities. We are keeping in a way open doors because we are testing and experiencing on our skin that in a way the heavy infrastructure turns into in a way massive burden on the final price of our drugs. That by the way is a cost-based obviously type of approach in pricing, but that is heavily impacted by all the infrastructure and the need in a way to respond to very complex regulation. This is in a way so we are now trying obviously to comply as we are asked to do, but we are really in an open dialogue because it turns that in a way for the number of patients that we manage in a year, in a way the overall regulatory fees in a broader in a way aspect, they can really impact the price for more than 500K per patient.
Very clear. Thank you, Lara. Lara, do you, maybe you mentioned it, but I didn't get it because the sound was not very good at the beginning. Do you disclose your agreements with the companies and your arrangements on this return of investment that you said, that you mentioned before? The royalties and all these arrangements that you make the deals with?
Yeah, in general, in a way, we are very transparent. We have obligations because being in a way non-for-profit entity in Italy, we have specific obligation of making public in a way all our banners. And so everything is declared because it cannot be different from our side, of course. So this was the journey so far, and this is really mandatory because of the specificity of the entity we are within the legal tax framework. Yes. Thank you.
Michelle, this data, and then to Audun as well. Audun also based on your experience in Norway, but first to Michelle. What if the companies, and Stefan kind of referred to it, already said that there is tons of data available. What if all of this data floods the system on purpose, perhaps, by the companies? Just me being cynical, saying that how are we going to use this data if the companies simply come forward with tons of data making the case or not making the case in one way or another in terms of this public support?
Well, it'd be lovely if they did. But I think that the first thing is, I think Claudia has touched on that, is we need to have standardization of methodologies or the data points that you want to collect. And then I think you're comparing apples with apples, as it were. And I think that there is enough out there to be able to provide that. And I think, Claudia's project has looked at that. Yeah. I think we also need to be, this is a starting point and a good one, but this is asking for transparency of public funding. It isn't yet going and asking for the industry to give transparency of all of what they contribute. I do think that if it is public funding, it is in the long-term industry interest to support this as well, because industry as well as others are asking for public funding for part of the work that they're doing. And it's important, I think, for this social contract that there is accountability for how that money is being spent, but more importantly, that over time you build up an understanding of what the true costs are of carrying out innovation, and that helps to shape the investments and the extent of the budget at the EU level. I mean, I'm not necessarily sure I'd agree entirely that it's 6 billion for neglected diseases per year, but that this is the point, is the more information that you have, the better policies you can create.
Audun, from your experience in Norway, and you tried also to translate, for instance, the WHA resolution into national legislation. What would be your concrete asks in order to be able to use this data? And to be able, well, to challenge you a bit as well, do governments know, do they have an idea of what is this public support that they're offering or the public funding, and in which types? Do they have a clear idea of the layers of support?
I think no, but don't tell anybody on this. But I'm very happy that you are looking into the real costs of development, and Stefan also mentioned that industry always claims that, oh, this is an additional burden, we need higher price to support this cost. I'm really tired of this claim that it's so expensive to develop pharmaceuticals. And especially when we say that, okay, your price is too high, based on a value-based logic, and then, whoops, all of a sudden, the logic they defend it with is cost-based. It's two different things. But I think definitely we need to develop a further, maybe an impartial academic study to really look at what is a fair estimate for development costs, because we don't have that at the moment. What is a fair profit that should go into this? This is important to develop this, or regain this balance between sustainability and innovation. We need to sober up this discussion. This should also be proposed how to calculate, what to calculate. I think this is important also for contribution to public contribution that can also be used. So, and the situation now is also new. We are in a situation with very small studies, very short studies, can't be that expensive. We're also entering a phase with artificial intelligence that can help a lot in development. So I think this is a good point to really look into what is are the true development costs.
Thank you, Audun. We have 10 minutes left. Benedetta Baldini, if you can tell us a bit what's happening in the newsroom, and in 1 minute, if you can give us also any questions, perhaps.
Yes, thank you. Am I audible? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, Gastein, first of all. Thank you, Yanis. So the chat room has been quite active. Many questions. I will start from the one with more thumbs up, which is, does Europe need a central public facility to independently finance R&D? This is followed by a set of questions on the transparency of costs, especially on the breakdowns. So what is the status of data on public and private support for research and development, and is it possible to break down these costs in order to facilitate the bringing of new medicines to patients? Then there were also questions regarding Article 57 and how it whether it could reflect indirect public funding as well, and not just direct public funding. Question also on whether countries should invest in research and development proportionately to their economies. And last but not least, I would also like to raise a few questions on the general geopolitical situation. I'll just pick one, referring indeed to the situation in the US and whether the policy from President Donald Trump on cutting R&D from the US NHS would impact somehow the landscape of research and development in Europe. There were many more, though.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to hear that there was a very rich discussion online as well, and that we got you thinking and we provoked you. Jacques Demotte, over to you for the first question. In terms of the central public infrastructure, the capacity to conduct trials, what would you say?
No, I would say that something important is to understand whether the indirect cost, the indirect support will be taken into account. For instance, the infrastructure support will be taken into account in the Article 57 or not, or is it just the direct funding? Because this would be a counter incentive for the development of infrastructure, and also more generally for the development of the science base. And the country where the pharma company have the more efficient development are also the countries where the science base is the highest and where the infrastructure are the more developed. So there is a need to take into account this indirect contribution in a way.
That's clear. It's important to have the full picture. Michelle Childs, DNDi, you're Geneva-based, so you're the most global person we have on this stage. I can't resist but to ask you the last question and the point raised by Benedetta in terms of the US administration seems to be cutting down massively the NIH budget lines. That means that we're going to see a massive drop in public funding in the US because for the National Institutes of Health, the budget is in the range of tens of billions annually. What do you think the effect will be of that? I mean, it's very early days, perhaps. And where does this leave Europe?
I mean, I think it's very problematic. I mean, particularly in the area that I work in infectious diseases, where the NIH has traditionally been a very big funder, particularly of early stage research. So, you know, I think that it's kind of will have a sort of iceberg effect in that it's kind of slow moving, but the reality is it's not the immediate effect. I mean, although there are immediate effects of the NIH funding cuts, but if you're looking at the funding cuts into research, I think there is a real question about where the new medicines and new treatments are going to come from, particularly for infectious diseases, and that's coupled with a number of the large pharmaceutical companies are withdrawing from this area. And so I think that it raises a question for Europe, not just in relation to the effect of those diseases globally, but also, you know, if we're talking about climate-sensitive diseases, if we're talking about some of the pandemic diseases, or even for antimicrobial resistance, where the sort of current drug model doesn't really work, the commercial model doesn't really work. It does rely on, and it will rely on public funding. So I think the question really, I think for Europe is how collectively you can come together to look. I mean, no one can completely fill that gap, and I think it's also cross-border as well, looking at other countries. But I think there is a real need to look at the way in which Europe is going to be funding this early stage and development stage of research.
Yeah, so clearly you think that there's going to be a gap to fill. Ilaria, can I come to you? Perhaps that would be also my concluding question to you. What is the fair price, in the opinion of Fondazione Teleton? That's an important component that I want to bring in this conversation before we conclude. You sign agreements with the companies, you try to impose some terms and conditions. This was also the point made by Michelle in her initial opening statement. But how do you go about defining this fair price, in your opinion?
What I can transfer here is really the experience of our organization that, again, is pretty unique. Keep in mind that we don't have to pay back money for the fundamental research we did at the beginning of the process that took us to be marketing authorization holder, because we are talking of philanthropic money. With this in mind, in a way, our approach now for the two products that we are bringing on the market is a cost-based approach. We are also talking of ATMPs, and those that are familiar with the topic know that what is behind from the CNC perspective for ATMPs is something extremely complex and extremely expensive. With that in mind, in a way, we are really building a cost-based approach where, as I said in advance, beyond the heavy, in a way, burden of CNC commitments, what, let's say, is really making a huge difference is the overall, obviously, regulatory costs that are on top of every single product, every single production. This is something on which we are really working on. With this approach, in a way, and including in our price a very, very small percentage of, how can I say, risk management that from our perspective is associated to potential, in a way, CNC disruption in the overall process for production, plus, in a way, a quota that we include, in a way, the concept of being a foundation, we will always treat patients in need of our drug, even pro bono when they are not covered by insurances of national healthcare systems. So there is a small percentage of that embedded in our price. But we end up for our gene therapies not so far, honestly, from the price of the industry. So it's lower, but it's not so far. This gives you a sense, in a way, of what's behind that. And we are doing, obviously, everything in a very different, with a very different approach compared to industry. So obviously, as you can imagine here, we are not paying big salaries, we are not doing stock options, we are not doing everything that the industry usually does. But irrespective of that, when it comes to ATMPs, the price for rare or ultra-rare condition is still extremely high.
Thank you, Larry. Important to have your view on this. And we need to wrap up because we are a bit over time. Audun, over to you. Are you optimistic? I want to come back to the European dimension. Are you optimistic that Europe will rise to the occasion in light of everything that is happening across the pond?
One thing I've learned about industry is that they need and they want predictability. And that's not the situation we're in now. It's very uncertain and a lot of things are happening. Maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe we can use that. I mean, a good crisis, you should never miss a good crisis. And maybe we can try to do something more predictable here in Europe. You mentioned a system for developing pharmaceuticals. You mentioned that there are a lot of different regulations coming. I think one very important regulation is the Critical Medicines Act, putting up the concept of strategic projects where the authorities support, foster, helps a needed product. Maybe that can be expanded also to other pharmaceuticals. I think there should be an overlap here. Another part of that act is pooled procurement. That was one of the things that came out from the Oslo Medicines Initiative. Use pooled procurement, be a better buyer. So maybe we should also look at other regulations and see if we can sort of use these together and expand on that. Let's try to find an opportunity.
Yes, thank you very much. And on this optimistic tone, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you to Ilaria Villa, Jacques Demotte, Michelle Childs, and Audun Haga for joining me this morning on stage to kick off the European Health Forum Gastein 2025 with this very lively and enriching conversation. Thank you very much for being with us.